This is going to be an answer to a question I received from Happy with What's There. I apologize, Happy with What's There. You sent this request to me in a PM uh, back on June 16th, and I was at PorkFest when you sent that to me, so I didn't. I think I saw it, but I was not making videos when I was at PorkFest. I didn't have any way. I had a cell phone coverage, and I had my laptop, and I had actually two cameras, but I did not have any place to plug them in, so I kept them off almost all the time. I've kind of been busy, and I made a whole bunch of post-PorkFest videos, and I have not gotten around to this. But basically, his question is one of how do we go about reallocating the state's resources to a free market society. And I think that this is kind of a two approach question. One would be theoretically, what are ways that we could do it, what would be the best ways, and then the other one practically what is or most likely would happen, because I think that they're different. Yeah, I think a transition to a voluntary society is possible. I'm not optimistic that it's going to happen anytime soon. I don't mean in thousands of years. We're not right about there. I think it is possible that it could happen soon, but I think that the sooner we place the date, the less likely. So if next year, Rothbardia, that's 10,000 to 1. 20 years, maybe that's only 20 to 1. Just get those are kind of arbitrary odds, but just to give you some idea on at least my view of it. I don't think the I don't think we're ever going to get a series of libertarians elected to Congress, uh, and a president, and ever have a Austro-libertarian federal government that will divest itself of its property to the extent we would dispute that it really deserves to call it that, but in some kind of just manner. That seems very unlikely. I think that we are seeing Austro-libertarians get into Congress, but there's never going to be enough, ever. There's just too many people in the United States, and too many regions within the United States where the ideas of liberty are pretty much fucked. There's hopeful regions too. So for every Massachusetts, there's an Alaska. Or I don't know if it's a 1-to-1 ratio, but uh, I don't think we can ever hope, just because of the incentives and because of the demographics, for um, a Ron Paul-esque federal government. Even if someday we got a Ron or a Rand Paul, assuming Rand was like Ron, into office. I think that, practically speaking, and principally speaking, the number one kind of focus has to just be on the government divesting itself as quickly as possible. You said in your comment, in your message, and I think this is pretty obvious. There's no way it can do it in a purely just or principled manner. There's just no way, because its claim to its property is spurious. It's a terrible claim. It's an absolutely terrible claim. Um, much of the American continent was homesteaded. I mean, even if there was blanket land and you paid the government and you moved on it, like, it was still vacant land, and so you shouldn't have had to pay the government. But the stuff that you built there is still yours. The fact that you paid the government first, I don't think invalidates your title to it. And that's most of the country in terms of property. It's not, I think, it's probably actually most of the land area, but it's most of the landed property, at least. Um, and this is an issue that I don't think libertarians talk enough about. Um, the federal government owns huge, vast tracts of land, especially in the West. There's a map floating out there that shows each state and the proportion of each state that's owned by the federal government. I think the state with the highest proportion is Nevada, and it's like 84 or 85% of Nevada's land area is owned by the federal government. On the East Coast, it's much less. I think Connecticut has the least, and it's like 2 or 3%. And east of the Mississippi, you usually have 10% or less. But and then that first tier of like Kansas, Nebraska, it's like 50-ish, and then the out west states, it's 75 or more. And uh, that really, it's not like the federal land is unused 100%. The federal government uses a lot of it for military bases and other things, nefarious things, and they allow it to be used, exploited, but only in a very politicized way. I mean, sometimes they'll let oil drilling happen. Sometimes they'll maybe let wind farms or, the national parks. They generate some revenue from those. I think they're probably net losses, but I mean, there's activity economic wise there, but not much. And I think that the government should divest itself. Now, the best way, I think, because we have other problems besides property ownership, because we have a lot of people who have given the federal government a lot of money that have been taxed, that have been had their property coerced over the years. And one really hairy issue people have is, how can we abolish a state when we have all these people that have been, had their money taken from them? How, it's not simply a question of right or wrong. Like, we're talking about potential survival, or at the very least standards of living. And I think that the obvious solution is that the government should just start giving land away. That they should say, listen, we taxed you for your whole life for Social Security and income taxes or whatnot, and you know what, we're never going to give it to you. But here's a deed to land. And I know there are problems with this, big problems when it comes to libertarian theory. There's issues of the fact that who gets what land, because 100-acre piece of the Mojave Desert is not worth as much as beautiful mountain countryside or arable land someplace. Although the arable land tends not to be owned by the government. But I think what's important to realize is, as it divests itself, this land will come into civilized market use. I think that if the government was to mass give away land like it used to, up until around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, I think, like, people kind of object to this and say, well, no one, you can't, you have all these people like in Massachusetts, there's no federal land in Massachusetts, so they're going to get land in Utah and Nevada and California where they don't live, and they're not going to be able to do anything with it. And that's mostly true. I think most of the people who get the land will not move out there and build a cabin or build a hotel or anything. I think what will happen is that they will end up selling it to developers. So they will get paid. Their government promise to pay them will never be fulfilled, but the government will give them a deed to land, not necessarily land that they can directly use, although probably some of them would, and they'll sell that land. And then the developer is going to be the one who's really going to say, okay, we've got so many acres of this, what's it useful for? Some of it is marginal and probably isn't useful for anything. And so I think that land would have to somehow be excluded, because that would be a ripoff if you were given, like part of the salt flats where there's literally nothing. And of course, how the government apportions is going to be very corrupt. And I'm sure if it ever happened, you would see all kinds of, someone giving all this really nice land to all their relatives or whatever. But the main point is to get it off the government's hands. Because even giving it to the corrupt bureaucrats is better than the government owning it. Because the corrupt bureaucrats are either going to convert it to something useful, or they're going to have to sell it. So you're either one step or two steps away from a solution. And really, that's all. I mean, I don't really give a shit about attempting to make sure there's enough revenue going into the state to make sure it can honor promises, because it's promised way, way too much. And especially people who loaned it money, fuck them for loaning the government money. That was bullshit. And they don't deserve to get paid back. Now, that's kind of like my ideal thing. I think going right out and homesteading it, that's okay too. And I think that what would happen is you would have disputes between someone who got the title from the government and someone who homesteaded it. And I think that they would have to decide that in some kind of arbitration. And I don't think there's any kind of rule, because we would be in a transition period from a mixed economy to a private property society. And there isn't a libertarian theory or any legal theory that can tell you a priori how to resolve those issues. They have to be on a case-by-case basis. So you're going to have trials where two old retired people who have title to a land in, like I said, Montana or Idaho or something, and some locals in Idaho who built a fishing lodge or a 7-Eleven or something, and they're going to have to work it out. And they're probably going to end up, one side is going to get it and probably pay a penalty to the other one and say, okay, give up your claim, here's $10,000 or whatever happens to be the thing. I think it's very unlikely that the federal government would ever do this en masse. This would be kind of like if Ron Paul got elected and we had the Austro-libertarian federal government. That's not going to happen. If we get a free society, it's going to be gradual, and it's going to be based on a regional, possibly on a state basis. This is basically the formula of the Free State Project. Of course, there's more than just the Free State Project. We got Free State Wyoming. I know people who are starting them in North Carolina. There already are enclaves all over the country for various things. I mean, neo-Nazis have enclaves, militia people have enclaves, Christians have enclaves, libertarians have enclaves. There are enclaves that aren't specifically libertarian but have libertarian leanings, and these movements are out there and they're growing. They're not particularly relevant right now, but as the federal government gets worse and worse, and this is kind of like the silver lining about Obamacare. A lot of people are like, oh, well, the Supreme Court said the Commerce Clause doesn't give them power. That's the silver lining. No, that's not a silver lining. But the silver lining is that this is going to fuck a lot of people. That's not a good silver lining. No, but it is going to piss the hell out of a lot of people. And a lot of people are going to start disengaging more than they previously were. And that's really, I think, the more likely scenario. That we're going to see people start to ignore the federal government more and more. They're going to take more and more steps to, be less influenceable by it. And at some point, this is going to translate into political action at local or state level. And that you're going to start seeing states that are just going to say, you know what, fuck all these federal laws. And, these are going to be like the mountain states and the more rural states first, maybe New Hampshire. And or maybe even just regions within states where you have certain counties or whatever that are basically lawless. And this process is going to happen. It's going to be more like not because people read Rothbard, but it's just going to in effect be more Rothbardian, where people are going to say take over federal lands, and the federal government's going to say don't do it, and they're going to say or what. And it's one thing if it's you and 10 other people. It's another thing if it's 5,000 people in 20 different states. There's not a whole lot they can really do about that. And I think that's the more likely of the two scenarios. And is it perfect? Principally, no, but there really isn't. Law and justice are not diamonds that have superly well-defined, delineated borders. It's just not. Law and arbitration is an organic process. It's something that gets hammered out in court, in trial, with arbiters, with jurors, with lawyers, and it's something that has to be specific on a case-by-case basis that can refer to previous cases but cannot be absolutely decided by them. And I think that's the more likely thing to happen. There isn't a perfect way for this, but I also don't think that that's any reason, to not do it or to think that it can't be done. I mean, this by the state having acquired its land unjustly, it cannot in justly dispose of it. But what we just want is it to give it away. We don't care if the first people who get it get it in an unjust way, because once it's not government any longer, it becomes subject to market forces, and that's going to eventually mold it into something productive. You know, that federal land out there is not being used by the market right now. We actually are much poorer because there's literally millions and millions of acres that are only used in the political football game of the government. Uh, Even if it gives it out to a bunch of cronies, which would be likely, if they're really honestly severed from the government, then that cronyism is going to either have to serve consumers or be divested to people who can serve consumers. And I mean, that's the end that we want. That's the end that we would eventually get. I don't think it would take forever. I don't imagine this would be a decades-long process. This would be a couple of years it would probably take. So uh, that's my thoughts on it. I hope it was helpful, and I'm sorry that it took so long, but you know how it is. So, all right, that's it.